Good afternoon, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer. Hope you're all doing well today, and some of my regulars must be seeing this and wondering, is everything okay? Have you been replaced by an imposter? Are you feeling alright? What's going on? Why are we playing Mono-Red and Modern? Isn't this Grim Flayer MTG? Isn't this the BG Rock channel? And the answer to all of those things is yes. Well, not all of them. I have not been replaced by an imposter, but yes, I'm feeling fine. And yes, this is still the BG Rock channel, but, my friends, I crave a little bit of a change of pace every now and then. Even the most dedicated BG Rock player on YouTube does crave a little bit of a change of pace, and it's been a year. It's been a year since I've owned a secondary deck besides BG Rock and other various black-based mid-range archetypes. So this is going to be it, I think. This is going to be the secondary deck in Modern alongside BGX, and if both archetypes port over into Pioneer, and if the demand is there for me to play Pioneer content on this channel, and I'm right now fairly optimistic about both being, the answer to both being yes, then maybe Mono-Red Prowess is going to be our secondary deck in Pioneer as well. So, if you didn't see my video yesterday, I am working. I worked earlier today. I will work later today. I'm continuing to refine my initial takes on BG the Rock in Pioneer, a couple different styles of build, and I'll be bringing you probably a Mono-Red Prowess list for Pioneer as well. But I'm still working on all of that stuff, and because those are still in progress, and because we want to get a baseline for Mono-Red Prowess in Modern established on this channel, to use as a reference point for any Pioneer builds, we are going today to do a deck tech right here, right now, on Mono-Red Prowess. So I hope you'll stay with me. We're going to get into it. It's going to be fun. I think this deck's really cool. And before we step into the deck tech, just a few quick shout-outs. First up is Albert. Albert is a fan of the channel who actually ran into me while I was testing this exact list to make sure that I had my little tweaks. I was satisfied with the tweaks I'd made to it. He ran into me in the tournament practice lobby, and I was playing the list. We had a great chat. He recognized my name, and then he said, "Look, man, you give me a shout-out on your deck tech for this," because I told him I was going to make a deck tech, "and I'll give you a donation league." And the donation league will be for the list that he was playing, which was a super spicy Enchantments Matter with Emrakul as a win con. Very cool. So I look forward to that, Albert. What up? Here is your shout-out, my friend. Thanks very much. And next shout-out is, again, to my buddy the Dogfish. He's a great friend, a great brewing co-conspirator. Whenever we are making changes to our established lists of our favorite archetypes, or whether we're tackling a new archetype like I am with Mono-Red Prowess, we kind of bounce ideas off of each other. So thanks for your help on this one, my friend. Shout out to you. And finally, a shout out to the series Sideboard files. Link to their video is in the description below on Hedron.tv's YouTube channel. They have a video that's less than a week old on Mono-Red Prowess that I found very well done and very insightful. So check that out if you want more Mono-Red Prowess content. Link is in the description. Thank you as always to the patrons who do make this content possible. Now, my friends, let's get into the deck tech. Okay, so before we go line by line, just a little overview on the deck. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the general idea, but I would call this deck Burn's little brother. If the little brother knows jujitsu, basically. So what I mean by that is that, like Burn, we have the same goal. We are playing efficient, aggressive creatures, attacking as early and as often as possible, and we are playing a lot of very efficient damage-based spells that generally, in an ideal world, want to go upstairs. They want to go to the opponent's dome, try to get them dead as quickly as possible, but they do generally also have the flexibility to pivot into a board-controlling role that allows us to extend the game if we are in danger of losing the race, and then win with subsequent damage spells off of the top. So that's the same basic idea. Just like Burn, that's what we're doing here with Mono-Red Prowess. But I say the little brother, but we know jujitsu, because the individual spells are less powerful. We have traded in powerhouse burn cards like Boros Charm, Lightning Helix, Skullcrack, and Eidolon of the Great Revel for cards that are a lot weaker on paper, like Lava Dart and Crash Through. So why on earth would we handicap ourselves like that? Well, it's not even a handicap. It's in fact more powerful in a vacuum than what Burn does. Maybe a little bit less consistent, but I would say more powerful. I think we have a much higher rate of turn 3 Goldfish kills on this deck than Burn does. And we also have much higher synergy, whereas Burn doesn't really have synergy so much as it has redundancy. So we are capitalizing on our extremely low curve and things like Lava Dart that are 2 spells on 1 card, and the ability to churn through our deck with a great deal of velocity thanks to cards like Crash Through, Monomorphose, Bedlam Reveler, light up the stage, and we are using that to abuse the prowess triggers on Monastery Swiftspear, Soulscar Mage, and the pseudo-prowess, the very lopsided prowess, I guess you could say, of Kiln Fiend, and we therefore have some real nut draw and real explosive potential. Alright, so now you know what the deck does. Let's go line by line, talk about the individual card choices. So right off the bat, you can't have a mono-red deck without mountains, baby, and we have some beautiful Odyssey basics from Rob Alexander. You guys know me, I love the old bordered cards whenever possible. We do have a not insignificant number of those in this deck, which definitely appeals to me. And I love this mountain. I think it's excellent art, very realistic, but also very evocative of the fantastical setting of this game, you know? And it seems like that kind of remote snow-capped peak, well, that could really be the home of the Monastery Swiftspear, but you also see that red tinge at the bottom, that kind of pit in the middle. There could be some magma boiling beneath the surface here, you know? The Kiln Fiend might find a home there as well, so very, very cool mountains. And while there are some utility lands that are playable in place of like a mountain or two, Castle Embereth comes to mind, I don't think any of them are really that necessary. I don't think the upsides are massive, and there are downsides to playing with too few mountains because we do not only just need our basics in general to be painless a lot of the time, but we do need specifically mountain as a sacrificial target for the flashback ability of Lava Dart, which, if you haven't seen this deck in action, if you haven't played this deck, that comes up way more often than you would ever imagine it does on paper. So we got to play a critical mass of mountains. I'm opting for basically the full 14, and rounding out the land base are 4 copies of the Canopy land Fiery Islet. Now, technically, even though this is like a 1 in 10,000, chance that it will ever come up, this could be 2 Sunbaked Canyon, 2 Fiery Islet, right? But Islet's cheaper on MTGO, really doesn't matter, and the point is we want 4 copies of these cantripping lands to, along with the other cards I mentioned, continue to provide velocity through the deck, let us churn through the deck, gives us some real flood insurance, which is awesome, but that's not even its only role. That would be good enough if it was, but with how low our curve is, even if we're only on 3 lands, sometimes it makes sense to crack a Fiery Islet. We can operate pretty well off of 1 land that turn and then 2 lands or more than the following turns, right? So you can crack this very aggressively. Again, we don't want to play too many copies, though. There is such thing as too much of a good thing. It's going to hurt us in the mirror and against Burn and against other aggressive matchups to go above 4 probably. And again, we don't want to play too few mountains for the purpose of Lava Dart, right? So 4 seems like the sweet spot. Some lists even only play 3 of these, right? But I think 4 is good for my testing. That's our land base, pretty cut and dry. And next up, my friends, we have the early creatures, the creature suite. There's also Bedlam Reveler as a creature, but we're going to put him in a category on his own at the end there due to the mid to late game nature of the card. But first up, 4 copies of Swiftspear, 4 copies of Soulscar Mage. These cards are non-negotiable core components of the Mono-Red Prowess archetype. Swifty is the most efficient beater in any kind of red deck wins deck that you can imagine, and Soulscar Mage is Swiftspear number 5 through 8. Definitely the secondary threat because the lack of haste does matter a lot in this deck in terms of being just as efficient as possible at closing out the game. But it's still a very, very good card, and that second ability is not just flavor text. That -1/-1, when we have a lot of small damage spells that can struggle to kill large things, Soulscar Mage's ability to basically wither the opposing creatures with our damage spells while getting prowess allows us to play some really neat combat tricks, and even if things don't necessarily go our way, it can allow us to shrink the opposing creatures to a more manageable size, which is sometimes relevant, and especially relevant against lifelinking creatures, right? So Soulscar Mage, a very interesting card, definitely an important piece of the deck. And finally, Kiln Fiend. Now, this is not strictly core. A good number of people play Kiln Fiend, a good number of people do not. Alternatives here include Blister Coil Weird, which is a basically 1/1 with pseudo prowess for one that untaps whenever you cast a spell. So Weird allows you to have threats, 1-mana threats 9+, and also play some cute combat tricks, potentially with instant speed spells in terms of having a surprise blocker. And another option is a Runaway Steamkin, which is something that gets bigger and generates mana at the same time. Kind of like an in-between of the Weird and the Fiend, I would say Steamkin is. But Kiln Fiend, I haven't really tested with a Steamkin, to be fair. I have tested with Weird, it's fine, I think it's good. But I think the free win potential of Kiln Fiend, like especially game ones, if you can just untap with a Kiln Fiend and you have a decent hand, you're probably going to turn 3 them if they don't have removal. So the presence of Kiln Fiend here makes the deck just even that much more explosive, and I don't see any particular reason not to double down on that nature of the deck. That's kind of what we do. And notably, because we are on 4 copies of Crash Through, gaining trample until end of turn for all of our creatures, that does play very well with Kiln Fiend, getting +3/+0 for every single spell you cast. So that is what the creature suite looks like early game. Okay, so next up, let's talk about the 1-mana damage spells, or I guess just the damage spells, because all of them are 1 mana in our main deck. First up is Forked Bolt. Now, I'm on full 4 copies of Forked Bolt. This is not stock. We're going to bookmark this. We're going to come back to it at the very end of the video because I don't want to get lost in the weeds on a detail while we're in the smack middle of the deck tech. But suffice to say, Forked Bolt is what I call a shock variant. There's all kinds of variants of shock that are all slightly better than the namesake card itself in different ways. We're going to cover at the end of this video some alternatives. They're all viable in my view. And the top 8 lists that we've seen in recent weeks, they're all over the place. Some play this, some play that. A lot of decks play a mix. Personally, in my testing, and I seem to be in the minority here, Forked Bolt has been an extreme overperformer for me in the shock variant role. The fact that you can tag a couple different X1s with it with a 1-mana spell is amazing, and it's not even like we're wasting damage, quote-unquote, because remember, we're getting prowess triggers off of everything. So if you've got a prowess threat down, which you kind of always should with this deck in theory, you're still getting more damage across by blowing up their board in a really efficient way with Forked Bolt. Of course, you can do that with any of the other shock variants too if you only have to kill one X1. But Forked Bolt allows you to be more efficient. You tag the X1 for 1, you tag the opponent for 1. Every point of damage does count when we're trying to close out the game. And on top of that, if all that wasn't enough, Forked Bolt is a great enabler for Spectacle on Light Up the Stage. So you can, once again, like on turn 2, let's say you had to mulligan. I think most games you want to mulligan to a 1-mana threat. Let's say you mulligan to like a 6, it doesn't have a 1-mana threat, you just keep it. The opponent goes turn 1 mana, you go land pass, opponent goes mana dork pass. Back to you. Well, you get to go land, Forked Bolt, kill their mana dork, tag them for 1, draw first blood, and then you get to cast Light Up the Stage for 1 mana. It's going to be a 1-mana draw 2 basically in this deck. So Forked Bolt, on top of everything else it can do, it's a really good enabler for Light Up the Stage. Just awesome. Just an awesome card in my view. Again, it has overperformed for me in my testing. But moving on, Lava Spike, just a straight up 3 to the face. It's a burn staple, and we want it here. It's tempting to play fewer numbers, and you do see some lists playing like only 3. But for me, it's probably a little bit too cute to shave a Lava Spike. I think at the end of the day, we are trying to kill the opponent. A 1-mana deal 3 that triggers Prowess is a great way to do that. Speaking of which, Lightning Bolt, no matter what kind of red deck wins deck you are specifically on, this is probably your best 1-mana spell. It's just a staple for a very good reason. Sees play in every format that it's legal, and you can't go wrong with good old Lightning Bolt. Gotta have the old border and the old art, if you ask me. Speaking of old borders, we've got a beautiful Judgment Lava Dart here. Another 4-of. We've got 4-ofs all day here in this 1-mana damage spell slot. And Lava Dart, like I mentioned earlier, looks a little innocuous on paper. In practice, this card is absolutely nutso in this deck. It allows us to, ping little things on the board, get prowess triggers, kind of like Forked Bolt, but it's instant speed. And the flashback, we can afford the flashback, again, way more than you would expect, especially if, like me, you come from the black-green school of value. You're like, ooh, cashing in a land, that seems like a high price to pay for only 1 damage. Trust me, in this deck, this card does so much work, it's amazing. And you're getting 2 separate casts, 2 separate prowess triggers for each prowess creature on board, all for 1 mana. Especially if you're going all in with this card, it's absolutely awesome. So again, you don't see every list necessarily playing 4-of, but I think you should play 4 copies of Lava Dart for sure. And the final category of the main deck, my friends, is what we would call velocity and or card advantage. And look, there are 16 cards that fit that category that either cantrip or generate straight up card advantage, all while progressing our game plan, all while getting prowess triggers and or giving our creatures buffs in other ways, and or providing a body in its own right like Bedlam Reveler does. So look, that's another great thing about this deck. We can grind, we can keep up with grindy decks. We've got the huge turn 3 Goldfish potential, but over 1/4 of our deck is some kind of cantrip or card advantage, so we're far from a glass cannon, and let's talk about why. So first up, 4 copies of Crash Through. Now this card is one of those cards that you don't really realize how good it is in the deck until you actually pilot it. The fact that it's a 1-mana cantrip in and of itself is very, very appealing, again, when we're looking for as many prowess triggers as possible. And the fact that it gives trample, as I mentioned when discussing Kiln Fiend, but it's good with all the other stuff too, really helps you crash through, as the name would suggest. The blockers, the clogged board states, the would-be chump blockers just get run right the hell over by this card. So definitely a great way to kick off a big turn or to finish off a big turn and, refuel a little bit for next turn. Warlord's Fury is basically Crash Through number 5. I did not begin by playing this card, but I was so impressed by Crash Through that I wanted another such effect. The first strike is definitely not as relevant. It can come up in corner cases for sure, but it's not as relevant as Crash Through is for sure. But, just another 1-mana cantrip with a little bit of a minor upside is good enough for me to squeeze one in for sure. Moving on to what is probably the very best card in the deck, Monomorphos. Now, this card, of course, does see play in all kinds of Spells Matter decks, some combo decks, things like Storm. And we are very combo-esque when we do start going off. And at the heart of most of our best explosive turns is the card Monomorphos, because it's a free spell in every way unless you are facing some kind of a taxation effect like Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, or Deafening Silence, because it's a 2-mana spell that generates 2 mana. You spend a card, you draw a card, so in every way it replaces itself. But we are shirting through the deck, and we are getting prowess triggers along the way. Might not, again, even this card might not look quite as impressive on paper as it actually is in practice. When your curve is this low, just kicking things off with a Monomorphos can lead to all kinds of really good stuff going on our end. So we did already talk a little bit about Light Up the Stage, but I don't know at all really what these decks looked like before this card was printed. I have to imagine that this really boosted it up a tier or two, because I can't really imagine playing this deck without Light Up the Stage. This is just such an amazing mid-game, or, I mean, for us, mid-game can be turn 2 sometimes, right? So I guess technically a mid-game value play, and it's not even like, okay, we need to pivot to a grindy stance and we're going to grind out this game, we're going to get a Light Up the Stage going. Like, you can just take one turn to have like a moderate amount of damage output and finish off with a Light Up the Stage, and then next turn you're setting yourself up for a massive lethal swing, assuming your hits off Light Up the Stage are complying with that, which most of the deck besides a Bedlam Reveler that comes too early will. So again, for all intents and purposes in our deck, outside of a couple really unlucky hits like the early Reveler or the double land off of it, and even the double land isn't that bad because those cards were on your top of your deck anyway. You get to play one of them next turn, and then you get a bad top deck out of the way, so even that's fine. But 90% of the time plus, this is a 1 mana draw 2 in our deck. I mean, we enable Spectacle like no other deck, and it's just that good. So yeah, Light Up the Stage, very, very crucial component of the deck. Finally, we do have the Bedlam Reveler. Now, everything I've said about it has been a little bit negative, right? So far it's been like, oh, well, this is a bad hit off Light Up the Stage. Oh, I won't include it with the early creature suite because we don't want to see it early. It doesn't come down that early. So why is this 8 mana clunker in our deck? Well, I'll tell you why, because it's often a 2 mana 3/4 prowess that has an Ancestral Recall attached to it. Now, if that's not amazing, I don't know what is. That said, it is clunky in multiples. It is clunky early on. Therefore, even though some lists play 4, I have found 3 to be the sweet spot for now. Maybe it's just powerful enough that we're supposed to accept the clunk and play 4, but a lot of successful lists do only play 3. I think I'm going to be opting for that for the near future, but as always, I'm interested in everybody's feedback, of course. But yeah, Bedlam Reveler, I just said what it does. We fill out the deck so quickly that it very often comes down at a relatively early stage of the game for only 2 or 3 mana, right? And you also, if you're priced into like discarding, like you can't quite empty your hand, maybe you have to discard a Lava Dart to it before you get to cast it, well, you get the value out of the back end at least. So some other minor synergies to be sure with the Reveler, and this is just a more resilient threat. Doesn't die to almost any damage spell, especially because even against things like Dismember, we have a chance of beating it with instant speed prowess triggers. And it does not die to Fatal Push, it does not die to Abrupt Decay, it doesn't die to some other things, and it also, the only thing that really beats it is Path to Exile. That sees a ton of play. Path to Exile and Assassin's Trophy, I guess. But in either case, we benefit to a significant degree by having them ramp us by taking care of an early creature if we can follow up with Bedlam Reveler. So yes, if they've got all the right removal at all the right places, then maybe they can take care of Reveler too. But even so, it will have gotten us that draw 3. So this is an amazing way to refuel in the mid-game. And look, just like Light Up the Stage, it's not like we play this card and we're committed to a really grindy, like several turns, maybe we're going to start to turn the corner. Like, we can play the Reveler and immediately refuel and then be very live to kill the opponent next turn, provided we've already done a decent amount of damage and provided that they had to exhaust a lot of their resources to keep pace with kind of our first wave of attack. So the Bedlam Reveler brings the second wave, brings the second wind to the deck. Very, very crucial component of the archetype. Alright, my friends, quick breakdown of the sideboard here. One of the deck's greatest nemeses is Chalice of the Void on 1. Obviously a big problem for us, very, very difficult card to beat. But, you know, if the opponent isn't otherwise curving out, we can still beat it if we've got a creature down underneath it and they don't have removal, because we can still cast all of our things into Chalice and get prowess triggers. Win that way, I've done it before, but obviously a big thorn in our side, so we need lots of shatter-style effects that don't cost 1 mana, so we can beat Chalice. Obviously, a lot of other artifacts floating around the format, and we are a deck that can take a turn off, maybe only getting like a little bit of prowess value at best to kill a very impactful opposing creature and not have it impact our ability to close out the game as much as it would again, for a deck like Burn, because we have that snowball potential if we can just go off, right? So Abrade as creature removal is very, very viable. The third Abrade could be diversified into like a copy of Smash to Smithereens for additional damage and pressure, or a Shenanigans for a little bit of minor graveyard synergy plus the ability to buy it back. So the third Abrade could be those things, but for now I'm just sticking to the classic 3 Abrade. It seems really well positioned at the moment. Moving on, we do have good big mana matchups. We do generally just want to race those decks, but I also, like, you don't ever want to overboard with a deck like this, so even though we don't strictly need the help against big mana, I don't think, rather play a card or two toward even those favorable archetype matchups to make them even better, rather than being forced into overboarding against some of our tougher matchups because we have dedicated more slots than is wise to those, if that makes sense. So this spot could be a Blood Moon, it could be an Alpine Moon, or it could be a Molten Rain. I don't know really I don't have a strong opinion, let's say, on how to rate those various options, but Molten Rain can flex into other matchups where Blood Moon and Alpine Moon might not be as good, and it does advance the clock. And unlike Alpine Moon, it is not vulnerable to EE on 1, which is already very good against us, or even, Chalice on 1 if we see it later. And unlike Blood Moon, it is a little bit more proactive and less vulnerable, again, to just removal in general, right? So while I do accept those other 2 options as viable as well, I personally have opted for Molten Rain in my big mana hate slot. Moving on, we've got 2 copies of Surgical Extraction. So the attraction, of course, to Surgical here is that it is a graveyard hate piece and admittedly a combo disruptor piece, but it's a little harder for us to get the combo piece into the graveyard in the first place and then hit it with this than it would be obviously on BG Rock with discard and more catch-all removal and so on. But anyway, Surgical can still come in those matchups. And unlike on BG the Rock, we don't really need this to be value neutral a significant amount of the time. We are happy to just aggressively interact while clocking as quickly as possible. This being a free spell that triggers prowess accomplishes both. So 2 copies of Surgical, real nice fit in the deck. And then we've got a Saheeli Sublime Artificer. This is a value piece that could be a couple different things. I've seen decks play Seasoned Pyromancer as well, but I kind of like Saheeli a little bit better. It's also significantly cheaper. If Spyro proves to be by far the best option in class, then that's what we'll end up going toward. But for now, the jury is still out. Again, lists are varying with all of these decisions. And Saheeli's really nice. Obviously, we are built to cast a million non-creature spells, and that's just going to trigger Saheeli a bunch of times. She's going to make a robot army, and that's going to give us a really different dimension. We are soft to decks that play a lot of spot removal and can otherwise hang with us. Fatal Push deck, very, very tough for us to beat sometimes, but if you're able to stabilize, or if you're able to land a Saheeli and then untap with her, and then you're going very, very wide. You're straining that spot removal to the absolute maximum. So her -2 does have some corner case utility sometimes if we've got a card like Shrine in alongside her, but she is basically just a value engine. Kozilek's Return, very spicy inclusion in this deck if you do ask me, because it is devoid. It's got no color. Even though you can cast it off of our red mana, it's got no color, and therefore it is a nice out to Core Firewalker and Auric Champion, other protection from red creatures that are obviously extremely problematic for us. And it is a 2 damage instant speed sweeper. So you're going to catch a lot of manlands with this. You're going to catch a lot of weenie decks in general. Again, we don't like, we can play a bit of a value game on this deck. You're very happy to sweep up their board, even though it's not technically advancing our clock that much. If we wait till their turn to do it especially, it's still very, very much worth doing. It's a very playable card in a vacuum. And finally, you'll note that everything except Kiln Fiend survives it. So, bit of a non-bo between Return and Kiln Fiend, but look, Kiln Fiend is more of a Game 1 card anyway. It's probably one of our more sided out cards in the main deck. And Soulscar Mage, Monastery Swiftspear, obviously Bedlam Reveler, they're all going to survive it thanks to Prowess and or Native Toughness. Higher than 2, so definitely a really fun inclusion here, really powerful. Finally, we have a collection of artifacts that we are shoring up various matchups with. Tormod's Crypt, same concept as Surgical, a free Prowess triggering piece of interaction, but unlike Surgical, it does clear out an entire graveyard, and it is one-sided, which is nice because we want to keep our graveyard around for Lava Dart and Bedlam Reveler especially. And Dragon's Claw, we gotta win the mirrors, we gotta win the burn matchup, and this is how we do it. I've had some absolutely insane games where in these test games with this, that Dragon's Claw, like, the opponent can go off almost as well as they could possibly desire, and they still can't really beat a Dragon's Claw without removing it, as long as we're just casting any red spells, basically. So the card is nuts in the mirrors and pseudo-mirrors. And finally, this is a personal favorite of mine, namely because I've been on the receiving end of it one too many times on BGX. Usually when I lose to Prowess on BGX, which I think the matchup is pretty favored, but I have dropped games before, and it's usually due to this card, Shrine of Burning Rage. It can just kind of, again, strain our removal a little bit too far, and it rewards, it punishes the opponent, rather, for allowing the game to go too long. So a lot of fair decks against us will try to stabilize early and extend the game, but Shrine will really punish them for doing that, because every time you go to your upkeep, or every time you cast a red spell, this thing gets a counter, and this thing gets gigantic really quickly. Lots of games have been won by just like, Shrine you for 8, Shrine you for 10, Shrine you for 14. It definitely happens, so this can be a single-handed win condition. Again, much like Saheeli, it is giving our deck a different dimension in the fair matchup. So there you go, my friends. This is my own personal 75 that I've been playing on in Modern for Mono-Red Prowess, but the deck tech isn't over, because as promised, we are going to talk about the shock alternatives, the shock with upside alternatives to Forked Bolt, and then we're also going to take a quick look at that sideboard files list that I mentioned at the beginning. Okay, so the various shock variants, I already went over Forked Bolt. Burst Lightning, we got the textless version, so this is a 2 damage instant. It's shock, basically, but it has, and it's any target, but it does have Kicker 4, and if you pay the Kicker cost, so you can do 4 damage to any target. So Burst Lightning is basically shock with a Kicker. That makes it twice as powerful. Firebolt is a shock at sorcery speed with flashback 5. So you can see how all of these are kind of 6-1, half dozen of the other, with interesting different upsides. And finally, Gut Shot does not strictly fall into this category, but this is mostly a flex slot category, and if people are playing some number of Gut Shot, it usually comes at the expense of whichever one of these they would be playing instead. And Gut Shot is really interesting. It is the weakest card in a vacuum because you're spending an entire card to only do 1 damage, and unlike Lava Dart, you cannot get 2 Prowess triggers off of it by flashing it back, nor do you get the second damage because there's no flashback, but it's free. It's free, so that allows for some really explosive turns, and it allows for some really interesting combat tricks, some blowouts in response to damage-based removal, perhaps. So Gut Shot is very spicy. So my experience with these has been, Gut Shot's very spicy. It's kind of a feel-good card, but my hunch is that it was going to be a little bit it was a little bit deceptive how feel good it was, because sometimes you just would fall a little bit short of killing the opponent, and maybe it was, if gut shot was something stronger, maybe we would have gotten there, right? That doesn't mean, I don't think any of these are unplayable. I think all of these are fine and justifiable. I'm just telling you what my own preference has been in my first little while of testing. Firebolt's really interesting. I really want to like Firebolt the best, because it's got that old Odyssey art frame. I'm a sucker for it, and I think it's totally fine. Sorcery speed is not as big of a drawback in this deck as you might think. A lot of the times you are main-facing stuff to maybe trigger light up the stage or something, spectacle for light up the stage, or maybe you're like going to technically wait until after blockers to burst lightning them just because it's good technical play. But if they don't have blockers on the field anyway, you might as well have cast it in your main phase. The outcome would have been the same. So sorcery speed does not cripple this option, just like it doesn't cripple Forked Bolt. And the flashback is really nice because, unlike with burst lightning, where you have to, like, if you top deck it early and you're incentivized to use it early, you're never going to get that kicker value. With Firebolt, you can get the flashback value as the game goes on, and Firebolt spreads the damage across. It gets you 2 prowess triggers because it's 2 different casts, right? So Firebolt, very, very spicy, and Burst Lightning, it's got that upside. It's kind of the best top deck in the late game most times, in most scenarios for that reason. You do get to 5 mana, believe it or not, in the deck, because you churn through the deck so quickly. You see so many cards. You do hit your land drops despite only 18 lands, and it's instant. Now, I think in the recent leagues, Burst Lightning has seen more play than any of these alternatives, all things considered, which I find really interesting, because if I were to rate them left to right, being my favorite to my least favorite, I would probably rate them like this. Forked Bolt, again, has been such an all-star for me. I can't even tell you how the flexibility of this card has been so impactful. But I really like the concept of Firebolts as well. And then Burst Lightning, again, I think it's fine, nothing wrong with it. But to me, it just has been just slightly that little bit weaker than the other 2 options. But your mileage may vary. I think they're all very cool, and it's awesome that this type of decision, what version of Shock to play, is actually a really cool component of deck building in this. And finally, my friends, I just want to show you the list from the video that I mentioned a couple times from Sideboard Files. Just quickly go over a couple differences from mine. They are playing 1 copy of Castle Embereth, which I think is very, very justifiable. Does let you squeeze out an extra point or 2 of damage if the game goes long, and it's kind of pure upside, and it's very unlikely that it will ETB tapped. But on the other hand, you do keep a lot of 1-landers with this deck if you have a 1-mana creature. And for me, I'm just personally not choosing to risk the absolute tempo blowout of this potentially entering tapped. I don't know if the upside is worth that risk, even if the risk is relatively low, but I think it's a viable choice anyway. They are on a 3rd copy of Kiln Fiend, and notably, they have opted for the full 4 Firebolt. Now, as I mentioned, I think Burst Lightning is the most popular inclusion in this slot. Firebolt is probably the least popular, but the pilot there featured in the interview has the full 4 Firebolt, and as I mentioned, I really like the card too personally, but I'm opting for Forked Bolt, and otherwise it's a lot of the same stuff I am up to. They do have a 2nd Tormod's Crypt, no Surgical, which is interesting. I think that's fine. I could even see going to 2 Crypt, 1 Surgical. We'll see how it all plays out. And there's only 13 cards here because the pilot has 2 cards that I don't own, which is 2 copies of Seasoned Pyromancer for that extra grindy value, and it's good deck building because that Pyromancer loot effect has good synergy with the flashback of Firebolt, in addition to the flashback of Lava Dart and the Bedlam Reveler casting cost reduction. So a couple copies of Spyro to round out that list. But there you go, my friends. A couple different takes and some insights into the nuances of Mono-Red Prowess. So shout out once again to the Sideboard Files Mono-Red Prowess video, to the Dogfish for helping brew from scratch my list that ended up actually being pretty close to what Sideboard Files did. I found their video after we already had done a lot of work on my list. And shout out again to Albert And of course, thank you as always to the patrons who do make this content possible. And guys, I'm still pretty new to Mono-Red Prowess, so if you have any suggestions, and crucially, if you have any ideas for how to take this deck into Pioneer, let's talk about it. Let's leave the comments in the comments section below. Remember to like, share, comment, subscribe to the channel. If you are enjoying this content, Patreon is the very best way to give back. And yeah, we're going to be playing this deck in Modern, and we're probably going to be playing it in Pioneer. I think most of these cards are going to port over. Yes, we lose out on some impactful stuff. Obviously, no Lightning Bolt, no Lava Spike, no Monomorpho, so we're losing a lot of good cards. But we get to port the Creature Core over, and that includes Bedlam Reveler. And we get to probably load up more heavily on the cantrips, and a lot of the shock variants we talked about also don't port over, but there are even more shock alternatives that are Pioneer legal. We still got Light Up the Stage, Skewer the Critics, so lots of possibilities. Let's get that brewed too. It's a very exciting time, my friends, and I hope you will stay tuned to the channel as we talk about Prowess in both formats and BG Rock in both formats, and continue doing theory videos, analytical videos, and donation leagues as well. Thanks again for watching. I will talk to you soon. Hope everybody out there has a wonderful day.